Good morning, folks. Instructor Gaynor here. We're going to be starting for the second time what I'm calling Social Contract Ethics Part 2. Per the structure of this textbook, many of these normative theories, you'll notice the first of the chapters sort of lays out the main ideas of a particular theory, and then by the end of the chapter, there's a little bit of critical discussion. And then the second chapter tends to deal largely with the problems associated with that normative theory. This chapter is no different. We'll be mostly talking about some concerns with regard to social contract ethics. Now, before we do that, though, I just wanted to reiterate that social contract ethics has a very clear and concise answer to the question, why be moral? Goes simply like this. You ought to be moral because it will benefit you. Why does it benefit you? Well, the idea is rationally self-interested individuals would like to live in a society that benefits them. And this, recall, this is a little bit of a review of Hobbes. In the state of nature, absent civil society, we are in a situation that none of us would want to be in, because life would be brutish, nasty, solitary, and short. This is why we give up some of our natural rights, our natural freedom, for the security of civil society. Thomas Hobbes would say that we are better off with civil society, because only civil society enables us to advance in most of the ways that matter to us, technologically, intellectually, and so forth. Now, folks, before I talk more about Hobbes in the full, I did want to talk about a little bit more about something that's really not in the text. Just like Kantians don't necessarily agree on everything, and not all utilitarians agree on everything, not all those who support the notion of social contract theory all agree on everything. And this is not in the textbook, but it's worth noting. Hobbes' version of this, and I kind of alluded to this already, Hobbes' version of the social contract argues what it does is it argues for a social contract. In other words, the stipulations on what the contents of that social contract are for Hobbes, not quite as clearly detailed as the version that we discussed for John Rawls. This is why some people, taking notes from the original Hobbesian version, actually would argue for what I refer to as a minimalist version of a social contract. I have friends who think that the social contract ought to be a minimal one. And when I say a minimal one, I'm talking about very limited government interference. I'm talking about my libertarian friends here. Libertarians believe that the social contract should be relatively thin, that the scope of government, the scope of our giving up our freedoms for the security of the free state, ought to be minimally intrusive on us. Now, keep in mind, their argument is because free, rational individuals ought to be able to make their own decisions about just about everything, apart from what? You can't decide not to have a police force. And of course, we need at least a minimalist military. For what reason? To protect us from outside invaders. Now, keep in mind, many of your libertarian friends are probably very critical of the government for doing what kinds of things. All kinds of foreign endeavors, spending tons and tons of money on what some libertarians call needless, endless war. You've heard this before, right? Mr. Dukes.
I don't know if this is maybe this is my opinion, but out of chaos, then come prosperity.
Well, the idea here is the social contract. Before there's a social contract, there is no prosperity. We come to prosper whenever we come together, and as the social contract would say, we cooperate a bit. We cooperate just enough for this. We cooperate just enough for there to be socioeconomic stability. Because that chaotic situation where everybody is out for themselves is one that would be untenable. Because guess what? Without any laws, according to social contract ethics, there's no grounds for calling stealing immoral. There's no grounds for calling murder immoral. Because remember, the law of nature, in the state of nature, it's kill or be killed, eat or be eaten, things of this nature. This is why we give up some of our freedom for the stability and security of society. Now, folks, the version of the social contract that John Rawls of Harvard was arguing for is what I've referred to as a much thicker account of the social contract. Why? Because his version of the social contract is concerned with justice as fairness. And the idea is that we would enter into a social contract, not only whose terms are fair, but ones that will end up doing what? Maximizing our overall good. Now, this is not discussed in the text in detail, but I want to mention it. John Rawls, in his own arguments, contends that his way of looking at the social contract lines up more with Immanuel Kant's account of justice. This is because he's concerned with fairness. Some people look at his version of the contract and say, because he is concerned with the idea that if we give up some of our freedom in a fair society, we would only agree to degrees of unfairness if it would raise the bar for everybody. That is, if everybody would be better off. This concern with being better off in that sense makes it seem very utilitarian-like. And you know what? That aspect of it is utilitarian-like. However, he gets to it from this position by contending that free and rational human beings care about this. This is why we would only agree to a social contract if it would be fair, or I should say maximize fairness insofar as we can, but one that would be mutually beneficial, that would raise the bar for everybody. Now, folks, why raise the bar for everybody? Why should I give a rip about anyone else? Now, this is review, folks. Remember that when Rawls says that when we're deciding fairness, we have to do so by using this hypothetical that he called the what? That hypothetical was what he called the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance means that when I'm deciding whether or not a society is a fair and equitable one, I have to imagine that I don't know which individual member of that society I would be. Given that I could have been born into a very different situation than I was, I would want to rationally hedge my bets. That's not his language, that's mine. I would want to rationally hedge my bets. In other words, I would want a society that treats the least of us at least decently well. Now, folks, this is not in the text, but his concern with the least of us perhaps was partly the rational philosopher John Rawls. But I also want to note very clearly he was Catholic too. And he cared about, his religion was that very humanitarian style of Catholicism. Not this libertarian kind that many current American Catholics have adopted. As a matter of fact, his model of a good social contract would probably look less like the American social contract and more like whose version of a social contract? Some of our Northern European counterparts, where many Americans would say they have less liberty than we do, and that remains to be seen. Many Americans would say they have less liberty than we do, but they certainly have more what than we do? That's called socioeconomic security. Because most of these countries in Northern and most of the OECD have some form of universal health coverage. In other words, health care is treated there as a right. Now, this is partly because, and I'm going to talk dollars and cents, society ends up picking up the tab either way, whether you have a thick social contract or not. Because the social cost of sick individuals within that society will be borne by other people one way or another. The question is, do you take care of it by preventing it? Or do you let the chips fall and then pay for it later? This is why some people, and this is one issue on which many contractarians disagree. Many people think the government should not be involved with that at all. Many people don't think the government should even be involved with the economy at all, that there should be no Federal Reserve, that these things shouldn't be part of our social contract. Other people think that the social contract ought to be a lot more substantial. Now, of course, remember this was the question. Would free, rational beings necessarily agree to the same rules? Now, the short answer to that question is, on many general things, the answer would be clearly yes. We would all agree to laws against things like slavery, if we were being rational beings, torture, well, notice I said generally speaking, theft. In other words, most of the things that we take for granted as being wrong would be wrong according to the social contract. Where we disagree are on some socioeconomic issues, as well as things like this. There are no moral problems essays on the extent of free speech. But you'll notice that within most social contracts, there is a lot of disagreement over what should be prohibited speech and what should not be prohibited speech. There is also disagreement on things like gun control. There is disagreement over what the extent of our rights to bodily self-determination are. So in other words, people disagree within a social contract. Now this leads us to the next question. According to social contract theory, should all free and rational beings agree to the very same rules? According to John Rawls, that answer would be yes. Then why do we disagree so much? My pat answer to that is this. According to Rawls, many people are not being rational about it. They're letting what enter their equation when they're thinking about it. Yeah, they're letting their emotions in. They're letting their biases in that prevent them from seeing clearly what social contract factors would actually be truly fair, and also what would be in our overall self-interest. And I don't want to make too much of this now during political season, But it's probably not lost on you that the way we do politics systematically distorts people's thinking by throwing out false information, by grossly exaggerating things, and also by getting people to pit Americans against Americans. In other words, people who disagree with you about the social contract, you are almost trained to think of them as your enemy. So it's no wonder we have difficulty agreeing on what good terms of the social contract are. The way we do politics might actually systematically distort things and might actually exacerbate not the most rational parts of us, but might exacerbate our irrational fears and things of this nature. So yeah, it's no wonder we disagree on the terms of the social contract. But the question is, when we disagree, are we being rational? Of course, this might lead to the next question, who's rational? Because remember, everybody in their own mindsets thinks that they're the ones who are being rational, and it's the other guy that's being stupid, or not seeing things clearly, or can't do math, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, you probably read internet blogs, you know, people who troll people who they disagree with, right? Anyhow, I just wanted to reiterate this a little bit more. Now, the next part in this chapter, and this is not recap, endemic to social contracts, and by the way, endemic to any society. This is why this is not just an issue of social contracts. This is endemic to every society, regardless of the way the author puts it, are what the author calls free rider problems. Folks, the author doesn't just call them free rider problems. This phrase is frequently used in our political discourse, well, at least it's sometimes used in our political discourse. A free rider problem refers to individuals within the context of the social contract who benefit from the social contract, but do not meaningfully contribute to it. A free rider is one who benefits, but does not contribute. Because remember, a fair contract is one where everybody benefits, but everybody also has to give something up. Now, folks, I'll give you a couple examples of free rider problems. A tax cheat would be an example of a person trying to play the free rider. Nobody likes to pay any more in taxes than they have to, because understandably, we all want money and we don't want to, pay any more than we have to. But keep in mind, when the system is working properly, our tax dollars are going towards things that benefit everybody, like the highway system and things of this nature. Now, suppose that someone says, I think I can cheat the system here. I can get away with cheating on my taxes. Now, guess what? He might rationalize that because he can get away with it and he will still reap the benefits of the social contract, that he should go ahead and do it. Now, Thomas Hobbes calls this person the what? He calls this person the fool. He says the fool is the person who thinks that because he can and he would benefit from breaking the social contract in this way, that he ought to go ahead and do it. Now, the quick rebuttal here is this person is a fool because for you to cheat the social contract, you are basically implicitly undermining the very foundation of the social contract. And notice that if you're going to cheat on your taxes, what are you implicitly implying that other rational beings should do? Yeah, the same darn thing. In other words, the fool is, through his behavior, is systematically setting up the social contract to fail. It may not fail in the short term, but it will indeed fail in the long term if a lot of people behave like the fool. This is why he says short term, it might look like it's in your best interest to cheat the social contract. In your long-term self-interest and others whom you care about, it is not in your long-term best interest. This is why he argues only the fool would try to get away with cheating the social contract. Now, the author of the text does not talk about a whole lot of examples of this, but you can probably imagine the kind of problems that are thought of as free rider problems in our political rhetoric. I'll give you one. Public radio, during their pledge drives, at least a year ago, during one of the pledge drives, one of the speakers actually referred to public radio consumption suffering from a kind of free rider problem. And it goes like this. There's plenty of people who use public broadcast who are not what? They are not sustaining members. So in a sense, they are using a service that they are not meaningfully contributing to. Now keep in mind, if the government were doing its job funding public television and public radio, it wouldn't be one of these problems. But ever since the 1980s, when the government started to defund NPR and PBS, they have had difficulties with funding. Why? Because they've tried their best not to fall prey to the problems of, what shall I say, commercial outlets. Because the problem with commercial outlets is they have a conflict of interest. Some of you probably heard this before. Because when you take money from companies in advertising, you end up being compromised. Because there have been times when powerful corporations have actually threatened to withdraw ads if certain news outlets run stories that might be bad for them. This is one of the reasons why some of us care about vibrant public broadcasting, public journalism, because it's not supposed to be compromised. This is why they need to ask for donations since the government started defunding them. So they don't have to go to the oil and gas industry to beg for money. So they don't have to go to Walmart to beg for revenue. Because as soon as you beg for revenue, your integrity ends up being compromised because you may not be able to print all the news that fit the print. But yeah, one of the fellows said, well, this is sort of a free rider problem. Why? Because you have people consuming it who don't actually contribute to it. This is one of the reasons why in the age of the internet, in order to pay the bills and to deal with free riders, some news outlets have set up paywalls. Paywalls. In other words, you have already read your 3 or 4 free articles from our outlet this month. Why don't you become a member? Because you must like us enough. Ergo, sign up for your online subscription. Because otherwise, you'd be behaving like a free rider. Former President Obama framed the healthcare crisis in this country prior to the Affordable Care Act as a free rider problem. Yeah, in one of his speeches when he was talking about it, he framed it as a free rider problem. Because it turns out that there were many people who were not buying health insurance. Why weren't they buying health insurance? Well, the argument was because they reasoned that they are reasonably healthy people at age 30 or below. So does it really benefit me to shell out a couple $100 a month for health insurance that I am unlikely to use? And you know what? If you are young and healthy, you are unlikely to use a whole lot of insurance. Or I should say, use your insurance benefits. That's why some people rationalize it's not in my interest to buy it. Now the problem is that ends up inflating the cost for people who do need it and buy it. So to persuade people to buy health insurance, and here's why it was framed as free riders, because if you do get sick, what would happen? You'd still get taken care of one way or another. And you could, of course, default on your hospital bills. Now, of course, they would ruin your credit for life. Nobody talks about that. Now, folks, I happen to think President Obama was wrong about this one. Because I would say that most young people who are not buying insurance were not being free riders. I wasn't. I couldn't afford it. I was too poor to buy health insurance at age 25. So to call me a free rider, I would take as an insult. Because my parents, from the time I was very young, told me what? You gotta have health insurance. You have to have it. In other words, it was drummed into me. And if I couldn't afford it, I thought of myself as a failure. I wasn't being a free rider. And by the way, I also wasn't using it. I also wasn't going to the doctor at that point. But yet, he framed it as a free rider problem because the whole idea is when you have a vast medical system set up, it costs what? It costs a lot of money in collective resources. Now, because it is collective resources, in a sense, everybody's resources are being pulled. Now, that's a little bit wrong in a system like ours, because our health system is run for profit. In other words, it's not really a public service. That's why I would say calling it a free rider problem was kind of off there. Now, of course, in societies where it is not run in the same for-profit way that we do, it would have been more fair to call it a free rider problem if someone was trying to find a way to get out of paying their monthly tax. If you live in the UK or Ireland, you don't pay $500 a month for a health insurance premium. What do you pay it to? You pay less money than that to the government. And the government filters the money where it needs to go, pay for hospital employees, things of that nature. So yeah, our system is different, and that's part of why I wouldn't really call it a free rider problem. As a matter of fact, in our system, I would actually call it the free rider problem the other way. Because if you think of healthcare as a public good, then hospital administrators are actually siphoning off millions of dollars a year in benefits, their own benefits if paid. And by the way, folks, I know this is not a popular thing for me to say here. Some of my friends down the hall might get angry at me. But I actually think I am a free rider compared to the average American. Why? Because I at least get a fair amount of my health insurance paid for by whom? By my employer. When many of my students have difficulty even scraping together the money to go somewhere. And of course they say, well, you deserve it because you jumped through these hoops and got this job and so forth. I don't know that I'm any more deserving of having health insurance than anybody else is. Now, of course, my politics are showing here. I happen to think that if I deserve health care, then probably everybody else deserves it too. I just happen to have the good luck to have worked here part-time with no benefits for about a decade before I lucked into gainful full-time employment. Guess what? Circumstances at the right place at the right time. I have no, what should I say? I have no delusions of grandeur about who and what I am. I know many people could do this job equally well. In other words, I happen to think that most of us, if you set your minds to it, can be fairly good at a whole lot of different things. I don't think of myself as any more deserving than any other people, for the most part. However, in our culture where we have this idea or we believe it's a meritocracy, and if you happen to be a have, it's because you worked harder or smarter or better than everybody else. And if you're a have-not, you're a loser who doesn't deserve anything. Well, that's part of the mentality of some people. But yeah, some people actually think healthcare ought to be a right. Sorry about it. Oh, one more thing about free rider problems. Here's the easy one that people oftentimes go for: public assistance. Now, there's plenty of myths surrounding public assistance. One of the myths is that it's easy to get public assistance. The reality, it's not. There's a billion dehumanizing hoops you have to go through. And a lot of people who are deserving of public assistance, oops, my politics are showing, a lot of people who are deserving of public assistance and would benefit from public assistance oftentimes don't even apply for it, because they've been told from the time that they're very, very young that people in public assistance are losers and you should consider yourself a subhuman for being on it. In other words, there is a social stigma attached to it. And this is why a lot of people who need help don't ask for help. So there's a lot of myths surrounding public assistance, and the claim that people on public assistance are free riders. Well, keep in mind, a lot of the people on public assistance are on disability. Should people who cannot work be considered free riders? Should people who are differently abled because of an accident of birth be considered free riders? There are some people, because of accidents of birth, will never be able to meaningfully hold down a job in their life. Now, we happen to think what? Or at least I should say some of our versions of the social contract think that such people's interests should be protected, and that a family should not have to suffer undue burden simply because they had the fortune to have given birth to a differently abled child. In other words, some people believe that there should be social security. Because after all, that was part of why Social Security was invented. It wasn't to protect old people. It was actually to protect young people whose parents died young, or one of the parents died young. Because guess what? If you were a woman in the 1940s and your husband died early, your economic prospects wouldn't necessarily be that good. So guess what? People like my mother, or I should say, her mother received Social Security checks in her name because her father dropped dead at age 37 of cancer. It was not a lot of money, but it was a little money to get them over the hump, as you call it, till she was 18. I wouldn't say my mother was a free rider, and there's a damn good reason why she wasn't a free rider. Because most of us are doing what? You're paying that money in just because it's called Social Security insurance. It is called Social Security insurance. Now, do you have a choice in the matter? The answer is no, you don't. It's taken out of your paycheck. Now, of course, the idea is rationally self-interested people would think that some kind of social safety net is an inherently good thing. Because it could have been whom? Yeah, it could have been you. Sorry I talked too much. I just wanted to make sure I went over a bunch of examples that we count or might be discussed in the context of free rider problems. Now, I already talked about this part of my bullet points about the disagreements over the so-called thickness of the social contract. So now we're at what I will call some other issues. Now, some who have concerns about social contract ethics address the issue of consent. Now, keep in mind, in order to enter into the proverbial social contract, the idea is that rationally self-interested social actors freely consent to be parties to the contract. And as parties to the contract, you will have certain duties. And in accordance with that duties, there will also be certain things that you are entitled to as a party to that social contract. Now, some people will say, well, none of us actually consented. Well, guess what? Going all the way back to democratic theory with John Locke, this problem was recognized. The way that we answer this problem is quite simple. You don't need to actually agree. The fact that you are participants in a social contract basically implies what we call tacit agreement. Because you are within a society that is based in a social contract, it is implicit that you have consented to it and that you will abide by the terms of the contract insofar as you are able to. Now, of course, if you don't like the terms of the social contract, and you'll know you frequently heard people say, well, go to hell to Canada. You've heard that before. Go to hell to Mexico. Sorry, I'm trying to sound like some angry extended family members. You know, when somebody complains about things that they don't like in the social contract, they say, go to hell to Canada or whatever. Well, guess what? Those people who tell people to go to hell to Canada too, they complain about the social contract too. But of course, they aren't what? Yeah, they aren't telling themselves to go to Canada. The idea is if there are problems with the social contract, you try to change them. Now, in democracies, and granted, I don't know that this works very well, I'm cynical about this, you're supposed to be able to alter, modestly speaking, the terms of the social contract at the ballot box. You know, vote the scum out. Is that the famous phrase? You know, vote the SOBs out if you don't like the kinds of laws that they're passing and so forth. That is one way of trying to change the terms of the contract. Now, of course, there are other ways of trying to change the terms of the social contract. People don't like this unless it's people standing behind what they believe in. This is not in the book, folks. This phrase, taking direct political action, demonstrations, things of this nature. Or one way of doing civil disobedience was if you found laws that were highly immoral, you would get together with like-minded people and together all break the law. Why? Because then they'd have to what? They'd have to lock you all up. And the municipalities would pay tons and tons of money to keep you locked up. So the idea is, if you put enough pressure to get the social contract to get changed for what you contend to be the good, then that's one way of making it happen without what? Because the idea with the social contract is you're better off with a social contract than with what? Yeah, than with none at all. So you don't want to smash the whole thing, because that would be chaotic. What you do want to do is find means to make the contract more fair. Disagreement among contractors. I don't really need to go over this anymore, because when I was going through example upon example, I was talking about ways in which people within our version of the social contract disagree. Now, of course, each party happens to think that her own way of looking at the social contract is the best way. People who disagree with me think they're being rational too. It may be difficult, objectively speaking, to figure out whose version of the social contract is the better one. Because perhaps the very way that we do politics systematically distorts thinking. Now, the author of the text talks about the scope of the moral community as a potential issue with social contract ethics. Now, according to social contract ethics, the only people who really count as parties to the contract are free and rational beings. So this would undermine the idea that children have full-blown standing because they can't fully be parties to the contract. The differently abled, and by the way, unlike Jeremy Bentham and Peter Singer, animals would have no reason to be counted either. Now keep in mind that a person with a broader view of the social contract might make an argument like this, that free and rational people who care about their fellow human beings also ought to treat non-human animals with some level of respect too, simply because they're living things. Now keep in mind, that view does not stem directly from the basic view of the social contract. But I've heard people expanding the scope of the moral community within the social contract model. And folks, within the social contract, a Rawlsian version, there might be a good case for expanding the model. Because if we're willing to take into interest people who are significantly different from us via the veil of ignorance, it's really not a far step to be concerned about fellow beings that even if they're not rational, they are still beings whose interests at least matter to them. Now, folks, there are some contractarians who actually think that we should probably be thinking not just within our direct version of the social contract. Because remember, our society's duty is to whom? Is to us, the parties to the social contract, citizens. But there are some social contractarians who really think that we would be better off if we looked at things not just nationally / tribally, but if we looked at things more globally. Why? Because many of our postmodern problems are not just national problems. They are indeed global problems. And if rational actors somewhere else in the world is trashing Mother Earth, who might end up paying the price for that? All of us might pay the price for that. Because keep in mind, there are people who might actually be going past what their rights allow them to do. Because arguably, you have no right to take things that do not belong to you. I'm trying to be expansive here. Who owns the air? You know the old cliche, nobody and everybody. Nobody and everybody. But it turns out that there are some people who pollute the air very heavily. And some of us would argue, taking more than their fair share. Shouldn't those people morally, and not just legally, be bound to clean up those things that they wrecked? Now notice I said morally and legally. And this kind of deals with one last problem. And you might want to think about what you think are the strengths and weaknesses of social contract theory is. I happen to think that one difficulty with it is that it frames morality in terms of the things that are legal. Some of us think that morality isn't just about what's legal. Some of us think that our moral duties just don't apply within a social contract. I think that I have duties to myself that can't be explained within the context of a social contract. One of those duties is what I would call a duty to self-improvement. That is to make the best me that I can make of myself. Now, in my making the best me that I can make of myself, the idea is I'll also what? I will benefit those around me. So it's also kind of an other directed duty too. But you notice these are the kind of duties that you can't frame into legalese. My long-winded point here is I think most of you probably believe that morality cannot just be reduced to a matter of the law, which social contract ethics does. And that might be a problem with it. Perhaps the best that social contract ethics can do for us, though, is to at least give us what I would call a minimal morality. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Why don't do this? Well, because it breaks the social contract. Well, what's wrong with breaking the social contract? It ends up treating other parties to the social contract unfairly. That's roughly, in a nutshell, how that would amount. Now, please think about these issues further, and we'll shortly be talking about some other issues related to fundamental moral rules, absolute moral rules, and some challenges to moral absolutism. Cheers.